All right, and I think we can start. So welcome again. Thank you for joining us. Just to let you know, this meeting is being recorded. So should you wish to keep your cameras off, I do encourage you to use the chat function where you can ask our speakers any questions that you might have throughout this talk. And we're very grateful that we have Vlasios in the background with tech support. So he'll be going through the chat and we'll try and ask all of your questions live during this webinar. This is the Young ERC Instructor Support Webinar Expert Tips and Tricks. My name is Jacqueline. I'm the Vice Chair of Young ERC, and I'm going to be your moderator today. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our expert speakers. So today we have with us Jan Breckwald, who is a senior anesthetist and educator, and also a member of the IES-SEC. And we also have Tina Grief, also a senior educator and anesthetist, and current director of guidelines and ILCOR. So I leave it in your hands. Thank you very much for being here.
Okay, so welcome all of you, and it's really great that you join us in the evening, even if there is a football game going on between, I think, Germany and some other country. We start with our conflicts of interest so that you know who we are and which relations we have. And we will just give probably 5 minutes of us to each a short input, and then we will try to link these inputs with the questions you posed in the preceding this webinar. So we can probably just move on, and Tino has a lot.
This was Jan. This is my conflict of interest. I have no financial implication with this webinar, but I have several intellectual conflict of interest as I'm serving as a volunteer for a variety of international organizations. That's all. And with this, we are going to the objectives. So today we want simply these webinars intend to improve your competences on your C courses. And today, Jan will cover in the beginning a little bit the principles of feedback and debriefing. And I was assigned to talk about why the ERC is this way of closing teaching sessions. And with this, Jan, it's yours.
Yeah, thank you. This is really a short input, but you can take it with you if you want to tell other people why feedback is important. This slide is the summary of really extensive research. John Hattie is a specialist in feedback and education, and I think he has taken 15 years to get all these data together. So you can see 1,400 not studies, but meta-analyses were pooled going back to 80,000 studies and more than 300 million participants of these studies. As the basis of, he looked at what strategies which we use in education help to learn better. And you see effect sizes here. And if you are not really familiar with effect sizes, it's probably a lot more, it says a lot more than the p-values we usually use. An effect size of between 0.3 and 0.5, where you have the green bars, is considered to be moderate. So everything below the green stuff probably does not really have an effect on learning. And if you look at some of the things there, class size, for example, does not really seem to have an effect, or mobility. But if you move up further and further above 0.7, you really go into effective things, effective strategies for learning, and there is feedback. And 0.7, you would say, why do we talk about feedback and say it's so important? 0.7 is just above moderate. We move to the next slide, and then we see, Tino, could you move to the next slide?
Yeah.
Doesn't work. Yeah. Then we see another study from this group from Hattie, and they took the original studies now on feedback, and pooled these original studies, and then you reach a meta-analysis, but still it's 435 studies. And what they did is you see again the effect sizes on the x-axis, and they go from -4 up to +8. And the middle, or the median, is more or less around the 0.7 we had on the slide before. So you see a very large distribution. And this brings us, and if you just move the slide one point further, it just tells us that feedback is not the same as feedback. They conclude their meta-analysis with this statement: feedback cannot be understood as one consistent form of treatment. It's very different. If we go into the next slide, we can have an idea of why this is. And this is what in feedback usually happens. You have, at the bottom, you have an observed performance, and the line in the middle is the performance goal, where we want our trainees to arrive at. So just telling from the external perspective what the difference is between the observation and the goal is already a big and important step. And if you animate that, this is what Hattie says is the task level. It's just saying, and the example we chose is rapid sequence induction. And Tino says it's not rapid sequence, but it's rapid induction. But anyway, I think usually it's termed rapid sequence induction for anesthesia. So you do intubation within as short as possible time. And maybe the goal is 1.5 minutes, and you observe 2.5 minutes. So there is a difference of 1 minute. And if you just give the feedback on the task level, your performance, I just observed, was 1 minute too long. And what I put in there is the level of supervision. If you use EPAs, you know what that means. It would be tomorrow, I would still like to directly supervise you standing beside. This is already important feedback and helpful feedback, because now the trainee or the learner knows from external perspective there is a difference. But you can be a bit more precise or a bit more specific, and then you go, they call it the process level. This process level describes how I get to the goal. This could be, for our example, that you have a checklist for the RSI, could be proper head position, preparing everything, all your medications, using a video laryngoscope or whatever. So it's a checklist anyone can use, and it explains how the process goes. Still, this is not specific to the specific learner. And then we can move a bit further. It's the self-regulation level now. And this level, you have to, in this way, you have to explore together with the trainee what is important for improvement for this specific person. So this might be that the communication within the team is not perfect, or it might be that the laryngoscope is never switched on. It could be very different. So you have to explore this together with the trainee using the feedback conversation. And you would probably start with, what's your opinion on that? I observed that it took a minute too long and that maybe the video laryngoscope was not switched on. What do you think? And then you have the discussion, and at the end, the trainee would say, you would ask, would you like to change? And the trainee would define the way. So this takes more time, but it's specific and individual. And this would be a way to design feedback in the most proper way to have someone supported for learning. Now I left something open at the left side. And there is probably a question mark. Right. This is what John Hattie quoted as the person level. It just talks to the person and does not talk about the task. So that's the typical thing we have. Well, you're doing it well, and you just have to practice, practice, practice. And it's so unspecific that the learner doesn't know what to change. And if it's negative, if you're just, shaking your hand or looking into the air with your eyes or saying that was a very bad performance, you might even arrive at the side where you have these negative effect sizes in all these studies before. So with this slide, you can show how you can reach different levels in your kind of feedback and why it is important to be specific. I think that's all as an input for feedback. But we also have a problem in our courses discriminating between debriefing and feedback. And the next one would be a graph, Tino, below. What I put you at the top was how ChatGPT would describe feedback and debriefing. And the one is the feedback is for immediate specific guidance to make the performance better, to improve what we just looked at. It's a kind of assessment in a way. Assessment to help, but it's assessment from the outside. While debriefing is rather that you want to foster reflection, you want to come to understanding, and you look at the development in the long term. And if you look at our courses, this is a bit of a problem how to get this apart. In the right part where the small arrow is, where feedback is written in, it's about the actions and the results and how to make the performance better. But in the debriefing, that's the longer arrow. It's about frames. How do we frame things? How do we understand what is going on? And it's a broader picture. Within a course, if you have a scenario teach, you have this feedback now integrated within the group, and your team leader will initiate the feedback on what has been done within the scenario. And when you go into the debriefing, then you have a broader scope. And it's important to motivate your team on reflection and understanding and so on. It's about the why questions, not the how, but more the why did this happen. And maybe keeping this in mind, that what distinguishes feedback from debriefing could help if we discuss that later, what makes debriefing difficult. That's my two inputs, feedback and feedback versus debriefing. And I think I pass it back to Tino now, right?
Yeah, so this is only a transition because here's a short summary what we from ERC think makes successful teaching. And there you have in the middle feedback and reflection, but also it's important clear communication of the learning objectives, that they are relevant to the learners and linked to the clinical practice, active involvement, we focus on knowledge and evidence, and there are several motivation factors which might be addressed in another meeting. So you all know maybe this educational framework we are using, the environment, set, dialogue, closure. And today we are going to address the fourth point, the closure. And before we start, this rule of 8 Ps are always important: prior, preparation, and practice prevents poor performance. So if you don't prepare, then it will go differently as you thought quite often. So let's look into the closure. This is a rather formal, very stepwise approach which the ERG we choose. So whenever a session comes to an end, it's your job as an instructor to make a conclusion. And the conclusion should summarize what does this all mean? Why did we do it? What did we learn out of it? And after this very short summary, you are going into, is there anything open? Did we not address something? Any open question? If somebody asks, in the best way, you repeat the question so everybody understands what was asked, and then your answer should be follow the KISS rule. Keep it simple and stupid. It's not that people are stupid, but simple and easy to understand. This is the meaning of this. So you make a conclusion, you ask for a question, you give a short answer direct to the point, and then after the question, the summary. Something happens here. And the summary is only 2 or 3 key points. So for example, now we had our first scenario teaching. The aim was to distinguish shockable from non-shockable written. We achieved this. We know for shockable writtens we should apply defibrillation as soon as possible. And for the non-shockable, we should administer adrenaline also as soon as possible. That's it. And after the summary, we have to tell people what's the next part, where to go, and what follows afterwards. So in the course, people should not go around and don't know which is the next room, what is the next task. Why all this? Conclusion first, then questions, and then your key message, because we do not want that the last point was maybe a very awkward question, some discussion about a special circumstance, which has nothing to do with the learning objective. So your key message at the end is reflecting the learning objective of this session. And then you summarize in 2 or 3 points the learning objectives and send people to the next point. That's all what we have for the intro, for the closure. As a summary, we aim to promote responsibility and self-reflection when we teach, so people can perform on their own and change their behavior. In the learning conversation, you got an idea from Jan why this is called learning conversation. We want to develop personal competences, initiate future developments and overcoming conflicts. It's brief, targeted, and all in all, you as an instructor are supporting people. Be neutral if ever possible and critical with your partners. That's all from us. And with this, we stop the presentation and are back to Jacqueline.
Thank you very much for that. So before this webinar, we had sent out a questionnaire where people could fill in questions that they already had. And we have quite a few that I'd like to ask you and I'd like us to go through. But I've noticed we already have some questions in the chat as well. So I'm just going to start off with those. And the first question for both of you is, how would you correct an error if it's serious, but also if it's a small error in the basic life support learning workshops? And is there a structured feedback that you can suggest for this?
These are 2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
In one.
2 in 1. Luckily, we have 2 speakers.
What was the first question?
The most serious one. If there is a serious mistake, how to correct it? I would put it apart. Right. How would we address that?
So if I always said serious, the question was the aim is to improve patient care. So if something happens which really is affecting the patient, it's dangerous for the patient, it will not result in better treatment, then you have to correct it. If it's something in between, you can postpone the discussion later on in the learning conversation. But if, I don't know, if somebody is running around with the needle open and could could hurt other people, then you have to stop it and say that's not possible. Or if you're for basic life support, if you really see that the chest compression are too shallow, there's nothing, 1 centimeter, then it's the point to say, may I give you a feedback? Do you think this is deep enough? If he thinks yes, then you have to say, no, it's not deep enough, because you have to do at least 5 to 6 centimeters or 1/3 of the thorax or whatever you want. Very often it works if you simply address, is this deep enough? And then no, or deeper or fast enough or whatever.
And
So
the
maybe
next part of the question.
This may be also the difference which I see, direct feedback to the action and debriefing afterwards the process, more or less.
Well, I think that's a good point. And Tino, you always say something very, very important, I think. When do you interrupt a scenario? And there is 2 situations to interrupt a scenario. If something happens which really harms, that's a reason. And the other reason is if no learning happens anymore. There could be that there's complete confusion, or it could be that the scenario is going on and on and on and nothing happens. So these 2 things, if no learning happens and if critical harm is done, that is the situation where you have to interrupt the scenario. Otherwise, I would have the scenario running, going on, not having it run too long. Then, because if you have scenario times which are long, you tend to debrief too many different things and you don't come to the point anymore. So if you have picked something up, and I like to call it an ad hoc learning objective, which pops up. You kind of have to grasp it and then lead the group or the team leader in the learning conversation towards that point, and explore it together. And then it's most effective if the learner himself or herself discovers that there could be something changed and the outcome could be better at the end. So it's more like a referee in football or a swimming trainer or so. Don't do too much. Have the people get their experience.
Our next question, also from the chat, follows on quite nicely from what you've said. And it's a question from Ahmed. Are there any situations in which you would give brief feedback instead of facilitating a thorough reflection?
Well, maybe good example from Tino, 1 centimeter of chest compressions. You could say, that's interesting. I observed you're just compressing 1 centimeter. The guidelines, probably they say more, don't they? They say 5 to 6 centimeters. That's a big difference. So if you do your chest compressions with 1 centimeter, the patient will not survive. This might be a rationale. It might be a resuscitation you're doing just for a relative to show that you're doing something, but you know there's a systole already half an hour. But the notion in that situation is that you want to continue a little bit and show that you did something. Then this could be a strategy. But if you want to survive the patient, have the patient survive, you will have to compress 5 to 6 centimeters. There's a lot of evidence behind that. And the guidelines, that's the reasons why the guidelines say that. Maybe that's a way. Doesn't hurt the trainee or the learner because there might be a rationale behind. You don't know it in the very first beginning. But if you have explored it together, then you know.
I would say the more acute it is, the shorter it is. So if it's really 1 centimeter, I will tell them, this is not guideline conformed, this is not deep enough or whatever, do it. And afterwards, in a debriefing, we can then talk about the reason and stuff like this. If it's not so important, well, I would say nothing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Same to me.
All right. Feel free to keep posting your questions in the chat. I'm going to take you guys to one of the questions that was asked in the survey that we sent out first. And you should be able to see it on your screen. And that was, what are some of the strategies that can be used to open a debrief when you have little candidate engagement?
If I might start, if this really is like this, I would address exactly that. So I would state, so my impression now is that I don't know why, but that your participation, all of you, is very little. I don't understand what is going on with engagement. Can you explain what's going on?
Yeah.
Simply this.
Same to me. And I would,
Yeah.
if it's after lunch, that could be a reason, or another reason could be that all the group knows what you're doing, and then you could go further. You could say, okay, what's behind this? We'll go a little bit deeper into the topic, that that you have fun and that you get engaged more. Or do you have questions on that? It's not so seldom that the level is too low if your audience does not engage. And we call this, in education, we call this cognitive conflict, or if you are familiar with cognitive load theory, that's germane load. How to make it interesting for your audience. And you have to, then they engage by themselves.
That's exactly what I was also thinking. If they are not engaged, I will ask myself, why could I not engage them? So whenever something is going wrong in teaching, you have to ask yourself, what is your role in this process? So why I could not bring them in? Maybe it's too not interesting, they are not interested. Maybe the example is not close to them, to their clinical practice, and they cannot imagine and all this stuff.
But I think that's great. It's like that's what goes through my mind without very unconscious. But then I go to like a checklist. I use the Maslow's pyramid. I look around in the room. Is it too dark? Is it hot? Have the people had their meal? Whatever. I'm just screening that around. And then I can ask questions. Should we get some air in or whatever? It's a lot about, we say teaching is, especially in our courses, is a planned learning experience. And if the plan is not working, we're like the film directors. Then we have to look at all the things which influence the learning process. And this is the easiest is Maslow. The next one is tiredness, and then it's not engaging enough and being too shallow with your information. Is it okay as an answer? Should we move to the next?
It's definitely okay as an answer. It's interesting that you mentioned this concept of a planned learning experience, because what some people had asked in the chat is the more junior instructors that are starting out, what would happen if you go into a course with a particular plan and then you end up in a situation where the learning conversation can become repetitive? How would you address that?
I don't clearly understand what is meant by repetitive. So
you
they are
finish
always
a
doing
scenario.
Yeah.
You finish a scenario and you sit them down in a circle and you start with, how do you feel that went? And what does the rest of the team think? And you can get in a cycle where it can seem like you're doing the same thing over and over again. What are your thoughts on that?
I would suggest never use these sentences, because that's not what is the purpose of such a learning conversation. The first point is always they are doing a short debriefing, they are talking a little bit, I'm listening, what's the problem? Or I observed something and I go directly. So this was a nice, for example, this was a nice scenario. I observed it worked quite well. I do not understand something, or I had a feeling at one point there was not a clear communication. Maybe I was wrong, but I saw it. Could you explain this? So go directly what you observed, what you felt out of. Was it really good? Was there a problem? Address this. And in the end, how they feel can be solved a little bit later. But these questions, how was it? Did you learn something? So what? This is not a classic fit debriefing of a simulation session where you have 30 minutes for a debriefing. We are teaching scenarios, and this learning conversation should take 5 minutes, no more. And this is something different.
And Tino, if I can add something which is typical to the situation of the scenario teachings, we have a kind of a curriculum over the course. There are planned different arrhythmias, different situations, special circumstances, whatever. So we have a learning objective which we cover. So it won't be repetitive because it's not ventricular fibrillation in every scenario. The next one is an asystole and so on. So as long as you keep to the content or the topics of this curriculum, I don't think you will ever get in the situation that it becomes repetitive from the content. It could be repetitive if it comes to a ritual. And I would really warn people that we have our conversations ritualized, like, well, how did you feel? Right. Did you, and the other side will say, oh, yes, I felt pretty well. And then the question is, what do you think went well? And then the answer is, well, the patient survived and my team gave me a lot of performance. And this doesn't bring us any further. Then you have to go into more depth. If, say, the team leader says, I got a lot of support from my team, the next question has to be, where did you see that? Why do you think they did it? And get more to a meaningful conversation. And you can already start it at the very beginning of your learning conversation, where it's like you push it into different directions. You can say, as Tino said, the scenario went pretty well, to my opinion. And then you look into the eyes of the team leader and say, what do you think was your contribution? Paul. Then the team is out. Then they say, well, the team supported me. Well, no. Then the question is, what did you do that the team supported you? And this triggers reflection and triggers things we usually don't see in our daily life. We don't monitor ourselves, but you help those people winning some layer to monitor themselves later in real life. So I think the question is there about repetitive. It's probably, to me, it's never repetitive.
I think what Jan mentioned is very important. You have a learning objective for each teaching sessions. And if you really don't know what to do, then you can go back to this. So this was a scenario, this was a unit about this and this. Did we achieve it or not? Or what contributed to the successful achievement that we learned how to classify electrocardiogram, for example? Or what did not help to this if something went wrong? So this is a totally different approach than how did you feel? Only to make the point very clearly. Good.
Well, you've definitely taken us away from the how do you feel, and this concept that you mentioned of you directing that conversation to specific points, I think is something that obviously you gain by experience and takes a while to master. Just to make it a little bit more complicated, let's say you're trying your best to guide a conversation in a certain direction to facilitate that learning conversation, and we add in the co-instructor. So one of the questions that we got was how you involve that co-instructor in the debrief without ending up with two parallel debriefs. And the specific scenario was, what if the co-instructor has a very dominant personality? How would you tackle this?
Such a good question. Such a really good questions. And even the one, the below one, I think is more important. We could turn it around. And maybe we could put it in the blue book for the next section. What are the duties of a co-instructor? And it could be calm. Don't say anything unless you're asked. And then don't open up a new book. If you get everything confused and get a new message and whatever. Try to support your main instructor. That's what I think. It's maybe you have a little bit more, little other perspective, and you can add something substantial, but you just add it. You don't put it as the most important point in the middle. And maybe if there is an issue like that, I would talk about it with my co-instructor afterwards, but not within the session. Tino.
Yeah, so for the first part, what I'm doing in the short transition from ending the scenario to starting the learning conversation, I tend to talk to the co-instructor, what are the 2 or 3 points we are going to address? So very quickly, and usually I like that the co-instructor starts. So he or she starts, 1 or 2 points of this we agreed, and then I come in with the third point or doing a summary. This avoids my dominant position there, and they have always the chance to come in and learn, and then I can give him or her feedback afterwards on the debriefing.
That's cool. That's kind of team teaching.
Yeah. And if it's really a person which is too dominant, then after the first round, when you feel uncomfortable, you have to address this. That you don't get enough room, you don't like this. And then if this really hinders your way of doing the teaching, it's a point to address in the faculty in the faculty meeting with all the others. Because it's all what we are doing together as the 2 or 3 persons who are teaching. We have to facilitate the participants that they get out and can resuscitate in a better way than before. And if the interaction between the 2 instructors is not helping this, you have to address this and talk through it. Even if this is very hard, but you learn a lot if you're doing this. Don't shut your mouth. Keep on talking.
That should be one of the take-home messages from this webinar today. I have one more question for you on this topic of debriefs, and that is more about the candidates as well now. So one of the participants had asked us how we can optimize the debrief, allowing for discussion of possible mistakes, so candidate mistakes here. If there's a candidate who is actually more clinically senior than the person who is teaching them, the instructor. And the example was, for example, a junior nurse, doctor, or paramedic as an instructor debriefing a tachyarrhythmia scenario to a consultant cardiologist.
Yeah, we are talking a lot out of experience, but if I'm not sure what's going on, I would ask a question in this way. When you are a very experienced cardiologist, we saw this and this. I do not understand very clearly what is correct, what happened. Because in the guidelines, for example, it says you have to do this and this, we saw this and this, but with your experience, can you explain this to me? Well, then it's on him. And if he is not a totally idiot, he understands quite well there's something we have to clarify. Maybe in the stress of the scenario, there wasn't really an error or not a clear performance, but in the discussion, people can clarify it.
Mm.
So work with doubt, insecurity. You can ask whatever question you want.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And I think sometimes it's not so easy with experts because they have a lot more differentiated view on these scenarios, and they think a lot more complicated than what the guidelines provide. And so the main advice would be to keep the scenario simple. That you don't get into a situation where you start discussing things which might be specific clinical questions, which have to be solved on a patient-to-patient basis and make it too complicated. Simple scenarios, they help a lot. And the other thing is, of course, if you are able to create a shared view on what you do together, then you really get the expertise of this senior consultant cardiologist. But the senior consultant cardiologist should probably stick to the guidelines.
And
Thank
the
you for
role
that.
is, and the role, if you are not so experienced in this area, but your role as an instructor is different than the clinical expert. So your role is to guide the process on learning of a specific way of resuscitate. And this does not depend on the very specific knowledge on cardiology. So this to make the difference. So this is also the way you could explain why you, maybe as a substantially younger person, are now instructing this and this, because this is something about how can we bring on average the participants to a level where they can deliver safe treatment to the patient.
Mm-hmm. And Tino, maybe that also sheds a light on what a guideline is meant to be. A guideline does not solve all problems. I would say it's specific and well done for maybe 80% of the patients or the cases, and maybe for learners who don't have the experience going beyond that. If you do something differently than the guidelines, it's probably situations where the guidelines don't hold. They don't cover it probably, or in very, very rare cases, we could also go beyond guidelines, but this is not the case for the courses. So that was the reason why I said keep the scenario simple and don't open it to ambiguity where an expert comes in and starts discussing things which are not covered with the guidelines.
And how would you address if in this same scenario, we then had an issue with the credibility of the instructor? Let's say it's an instructor candidate, for example, and the cardiologist is making it very obvious that they do not think that this person is credible to lead that discussion, even though the information is, as you said, coming from the right source.
There's a co-instructor, there's a course director, and if this becomes an issue beyond the content, then I think it's something which has to be addressed by the course director level, and you have to carry it to that point. And then maybe you sit together and talk about the things we are just talking about.
Yeah. And then my job as a co-instructor, if this happens, I would ask the cardiology, what is your need to behave like this in front of a younger colleague? I don't understand your behavior. Could you explain me what is the need for you to behave like this?
That's quite direct.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
maybe outside. But
Yeah.
probably if it's too strong. Have you ever experienced that, Tino? Such a
no,
situation, such a strong situation?
no. Usually people behave quite nicely on these courses.
Uh,
They don't want to be the idiot or the nasty person. They want to go through a course, having 2 or 3 days, nice environment, and that's it.
It takes us actually to an interesting question that was posted on the chat about supporting the failing IC. Failing in the sense that they write an example for us on the chat, a situation where an instructor candidate is doing a discussion, for example, on post-resus care, and due to inexperience, it's not going very well. The question is it okay to take over without putting the co-instructor feeling intimidated? Or
It's
in a
not
broader
only
sense, how would
okay.
you support?
It's not only okay, it's a must. So if you as a second instructor realize that something is not on top of the knowledge, then you have to intervene and tell them, maybe I can explain this from another side or from a different point of view. And then you have to explain it because it's all about how can we facilitate learning. And if you realize that somebody is struggling working with you for whatever reason, you have to intervene. Sometimes this happens. Oh,
But I think what Tino just also had in between the lines, um, do not intimidate. There is ways to take over in a team orientated way, and could I explain it from a little bit a different perspective helps a lot.
We're going to move on now from questions on debriefing to questions that were asked previously about closure. And the first one is one that was asked at least 6 times, and that is, what are some tips on timekeeping during a lively session with plenty of discussion and team engagement?
I think this is the distribution of the roles between the two instructors. So one is leading the process, and I ask then the other one, if I'm leading, please look at the time. We have 10 minutes. Show me whatever after 7 minutes, and then we have to close. So it's and then vice versa. If I'm taking time, I will tell them 2 minutes left and close it. Look at at your watch, your phone, you have the time there, and stop it. And even it's lively, you have to tell people we have a large program, we have to continue, we have to close the discussion now. Simply.
Yeah.
There's no other way.
There's no other way, and it's very, very important, and it's a neglected issue, and all course directors get gray hair from that. It's really, yes, it is. And in addition, the closure is something very, very important because it shows us, or it tells the participants what to take out of this specific session, of this piece of the course. And we have, if we have a very lively discussion, which is engaging and lively and so on, we still have to know what to take out of it. And if we don't take the time or don't spare the time for the closure, it will be lost. And that's a real problem if it gets lost. So what I try to do, again, is the wording and the transitions. The first thing is don't let the scenario run too long. The more time you have, it always gets more and more you have to debrief and you have to talk about. So have the scenario brief and understandable. And then you can look at your times, the time you have left over. And if you have a lot of time, you can put your questions more open. If you don't have very much time, you can say, as Tino showed very well, how the sequence of questions or the sequence of action is at the end in the closure. If you say, is there an important question of understanding of the scenario we just worked on, probably nobody will say something, except from there is a really important issue which is left. And if that's said, then you can say, you all didn't understand that VF is defibrillated. My God, we have to go into it again. But not now, because the course is going on. We have to think about at what point of the course we can get to this important message that you really take it along. And otherwise, then you say, is there an important question? No answer is there. Then you can directly go to your closure and your take-home messages from that session. So the wording is really important. You do a lot with the wording, and you do a lot with pauses also. Pauses are important for understanding.
On that note about time, actually, I'm going to have to skip a question to make sure that we stay on time. And I'd like to take you to this one, because I think it's an important thing for us to learn more about. How can we ensure the well-being of candidates after the closure of the session to avoid them going to the next room feeling like they made a mistake during their scenario?
There's an assumption that if you made a mistake, that you don't feel good. I think all this with well-being, and it's not our job to make people happy and if they feel nice, it's okay. But if something happened, either in a not so good way, a mistake, or very successful, people change their behavior if they're touched emotionally. If they are touched, then they change. So I would rather prefer a candidate who really, in a way, suffers from a mistake, and we talk about it, and he or she finds a way out of it. How can you change the next time? And they might not feel so good, but then they are starting to think about the change. If something is interested, they are okay, we will do it, nothing changes. So if something was not going so good, we have to talk about it. I observed this and this, and I cannot understand it. Explain it. Let's talk about it very shortly. And over the time, they will feel far better with a solution than trying to sort out, and don't feel so bad because everybody is doing errors and stuff like this. This is not helpful.
And I would even argue, if you stick to the content, and you create a shared vision on having more patients survive, then the participants won't go out with a feeling of having made a mistake, because you work with a scenario. The scenario is a model, and it's for learning, and you can learn from mistakes. The only real mistake we talked about today was the experienced cardiologist intimidating a young instructor candidate. That would be a real mistake. And then I wouldn't have any problems telling this person, be it male or female, that this was a mistake. And then they could go out with a feeling of how they could do it better the next time. I think I would really argue, if we do our job in the right way, it's not a personal mistake, but it's a procedural mistake or a procedural deficit which you compare to a standard, and you can decide how to improve that.
Jacqueline, we have the assumption that all people in our courses are in the course because they want to learn, they want to do their best. despite of these assumptions, sometimes things are not going so good. So let's talk, what can we learn? How can we modify the team performance, my personal performance, to come to this end that everything goes very smoothly? And then, so what? Something happens.
That's a very valid
Let's see
point.
the other.
Thank you so much. This is all the questions that we had time for today, although there were several more that I hope that we can continue to address with further webinars in the future. We've got the last few minutes, and I want to ask you both, what are your take-home messages from this webinar? Yeah.
Well,
You're doing the closure.
If I start, yeah, it's about the closure. We did not interact directly with the audience, but still I had the feeling that the questions were made up that engaging that I think we could that I felt these questions were questions I also had on my way as an instructor, and which I sometimes at that times had the feeling I could not ask anybody or I could not address. And it's like a normal human's feeling. Now I'm in a position that I can say, do it that way or do it that way. And that was my take-home message. And I hope that it helped those listening. That's what I take out of it. And it's a lot of fun thinking about or reflecting on these questions we have gone through a couple of times in our instructor lives.
Yeah, I like it. I would like to have more interaction with the audience. I don't know how to establish this, but maybe more discussion. I would love to have this. Otherwise, I think it's a good way to answer these questions. Maybe a little bit more time. 15 minutes more would not be so bad. It's a thing something to think. So give because it's the first time, give the speakers maybe 15 minutes for an introduction, then an hour for answering this question would quite nicely fit. Otherwise, very nice. For me, the question is much more if the audience who were listening to us learned something out of this. That's the most important stuff.
Did you guys learn something?
Address this?
Maybe you can let them know.
This is something for you. How are you going to assess the learning outcome of these webinars?
Yeah, I'm hoping that the participants will tell you in the chat if they learned something or not, so that you'll have an immediate answer. And what I can tell you is regarding your 15 minutes, I hope to give you much more than 15 minutes and that we can do more webinars in the future. We're very grateful for the time that you both took to spend this evening with us. The last two things that we need to just quickly run through are two very, very small announcements. Just to let you all know that the deadline for the Young ERC Resuscitation Science Masterclass is coming up on the 15th of July. And now is a very good time to scan that QR code and consider applying for that. You can find more information on all of our social media channels. And very exciting news as well. We have the first competition, which has been running since 2021. It's the theme this year is the role of AI in CPR, and you can apply for this competition until the 1st of July. And if selected, you'll be able to present your idea at the Resus Congress this year. And so we hope that you've all had a lovely evening. And I thank you again for coming and for joining us. And we'll see you on the next webinar. Antino, you have positive thank yous and that it was very interesting and helpful.
Thank you for the honor to be invited.
Thanks. Bye. In time.
Vlasios will be happy with us. Our tech support in the background. Thank you, Vlasios.